COVID lockdowns. Researchers say last year was nearly 2 degrees hotter than average, and the Arctic surface is getting warmer too.
Chidi Oti Obihara, the co-founder of COP26 ClimateActionPlan.com and environmentalist, he's with us this morning. Chidi, good to talk to you this morning. Just talk us through the increase in temperature. Whenever we do these stories, the email system goes alive with people saying, yeah, but there's more ice than in the Antarctic than there's ever been. This is a con. Talk us through it.
Well, thanks very much for that. And you're right. People do focus on temperature rises in this sporadic way and do worry about events. They either do that or they look at the global average, which the IPCC tells us that the rise since pre-industrial times where we are now is something like 1.2 degrees, but is set to be higher. Because, of course, since the last 2 weeks, when the IPCC's AR6 report came out, a lot of people have been poring over it, trying to understand what it means, trying to put things in perspective, and that perspective is super important. And what you need to understand is that there are records being broken on a regular basis. And one of the most powerful lines for me is the assertion that there was an 89% chance that once in a century weather events can now happen once a year. Now, it's difficult to try and figure that out in practical step-by-step terms, but you can just show examples. So 48.8 degrees centigrade in Sicily about 2 weeks ago was a new European record. Now that has come far faster than many of the researchers thought. People were talking about the 2030, 2050 net zero targets, because people were saying that if we missed targets for net zero by 2030,
oh, we've lost Chidi there. Chidi, are you there? I think he's back.
I am.
Sorry, we just lost you.
I'm
You
so
carry
sorry.
on, please. No, don't worry. Please carry on.
Yeah. No, I was just saying that if we wait till the figurative 2050 net zero that we're talking about, we now know we run far higher risks of such high temperatures in the Mediterranean that we have crop failures, that we have regular summers that are in their late 40s. And these are risks. So people talk about them as facts, but these are risks. And the issue for policymakers, for environmentalists, for politicians, is that we should not run those risks with our future, certainly for our children, but for certain countries, as we're seeing now, even with our present.
I think the thing is, you don't need to be an expert to know. We're seeing this, as you say, these extremes in weather. I mean, that word extreme is used a lot by the Met Office now. It's very concerning. We know we need to tackle climate change. We need a huge international effort, don't we? And ahead of the COP26 later this year, which is in Glasgow, what, though, are the top sort of priorities for that summit? I mean, how do we now deal with this? Stop talking about it and actually deal with it.
Absolutely. So what's happening right now, as far as the agenda that has been set in the preemptive meetings that are had by ministers, is they're trying to talk about a global ban on coal. This is really ambitious. That's not where we are. You can't have United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres calling this a red alert, saying that the world is in code red, and stick to ambitions from 5 years ago. What we need is a stop to new financing for all new fossil fuel projects. It can't be just coal. It has to be oil and gas as well. Because the issue is that all of these fuels create a carbon footprint. And we need to draw a line in the sand, because there's a fairly famous meme out on the internet which has the Keeling curve going up year after year after year. So it basically has, humanity's carbon footprint adding more and more carbon to the atmosphere. And in all of those years, certainly since the early 90s, we've had COPs, we've had meetings of governments, and if they can't even guarantee some form of transition, they have to admit that this has been a failure. And so what we at COP26 Climate Action Plan have been saying is that in order to have a proper goal, so it isn't just another talking shop, we need to say, stop adding capacity in fossil fuels. Stop financing new fossil fuel projects. Now that kind of target is really good because A, it applies globally. It applies to all of us. We all have to take responsibility for not growing the fossil fuel industry. And B, the costs are relatively low. So no one can accuse anybody of wrecking people's jobs, of destroying a company. All that we're saying is don't add to the problem. You can't keep growing the fossil fuel industry and say you're in transition. Those two things are not compatible.
We've just had 2 years, certainly 1 year, where the world has pretty much stopped. We've had a pandemic, industry shut down. We've seen the immediate benefits in photographs of things that weren't visible before because of pollution and everything else. Is there any evidence that that stopping of things in a way that no politician could have ever organised, has that benefited us? Has that helped tackle climate change?
That's an extremely good question. So yes, so the unavoidable close down of heavy industry during the COP remission. So COP was cancelled because of COVID-19, and industry and certainly aviation took a huge knock, basically stopped. And in many cities around the world, deaths from air pollution plummeted. We know that wildlife, of course, came back. We know that the associated externalities that come from, excess hospitalization also fell back. But I think one of the really important benefits that came out of that was we saw that there was an alternative way of doing things. We saw that system change was actually possible. I'm not suggesting that we go on indefinitely not ever flying, but I think that there are lots of things that government could have done. They could have tied some of the COVID financing facilities, some of the QE programs they allowed for corporates. They could have tied that to better behavior and transitions from corporates, and that didn't happen. So there were lots and lots of benefits, bigger benefits that we could have gotten out of this that we missed. Those are missed opportunities.
We must, just mention the Extinction Rebellion. I mean, we're seeing the protests at the moment. I believe do you advise them in some capacity? Just tell us your work with them, and also how that's going, and are they being heard?
How's that helping?
Yeah.
Blocking central London?
Well, I think that the way it's helping is it's drawing attention to the extremely important issue in a way that is, in my opinion, incredibly progressive. We need to have more politics that embraces non-violence. We also need a participative democracy. We need people to be involved in things. And the way that Extinction Rebellion have gone about doing this is by, in this particular case, pulling out a table and saying, let's have crisis talks. Okay, COPs in the past have failed. Members of the public can have an opinion that is valid, that is amplified by Extinction Rebellion. And if people come to the table and they tell us, we think that there should be a tax on aviation fuel, then we can start talking about it. We start the conversation. People come to the table and they say, banks shouldn't be allowed to fund new fossil fuel projects without being taxed, without paying a polluter pays tax, then we can start that conversation. So XR doesn't make unreasonable demands, in my opinion. XR facilitates. So XR says, tell the truth, act now, get people's assemblies, so you have more participation, more involvement. I think all of those things help.
I'm getting tweets following your interview, just saying you haven't explained ice expansion in Antarctica. A few people pointing that out. How do you do that?
Well, as I said earlier on, what we're arguing about is the risk of climate breakdown. I think that when you talk about 2 degrees warming or 3 degrees warming, everyone assumes that everywhere in the world temperatures are going to go up by exactly 2 degrees. But that's not the case. What happens with 2 degree average warming is that some parts of the world get very, very hot, and some parts of the world simultaneously get cold unexpectedly, get climate breakdown. So while you're getting 49 degrees centigrade almost in Sicily 2 weeks ago, a new record being set there, hypothetically, in our complex, chaotic weather system, climate breakdown might mean that in the Antarctic, you get an extra cold winter, briefly. But on average, over time, we know it's going to be warmer. That's how you explain that.
Okay, yeah, very, very good to speak to you as ever. Thank you very much indeed for joining us this morning.
Thank you.
Now, coming up on the programme with more youngsters opting